Hello everyone, this is AndresRestart, and today I would like to talk about how you should not be worried about Metroid Prime 4 Beyond. I keep seeing people talk about or share their concerns about Metroid Prime 4. Some people think this is not going to be a good game. Some people think this is going to be a commercial flop. Some people think this game is going to get cancelled or at least delayed. I don't really think it's reasonable to have any of those expectations. Like, sure, anything is possible, but when we take a closer look at what we've seen in Metroid Prime 4 so far, the history of things, and how Nintendo operates, I really don't think we should be even remotely worried about Metroid Prime 4. I think we should actually be pretty safe in having pretty optimistic expectations for Metroid Prime 4 in a variety of ways. It coming out on time, it being more than just a good game but a great game, and having at least a decent amount of commercial success. And that's what I would like to focus on today, easing the concerns for many on Metroid Prime 4 Beyond. But before going forward, let me point out I have this goal to reach 60,000 subscribers, so if you find yourself enjoying my content, your subscription would be appreciated. So I've already made this point already in a couple different discussions over the last week or so, but I'll just expand upon it a little bit more for those who haven't seen this argument. Metroid Prime 4 Beyond almost certainly is not going to get delayed or cancelled. Firstly, the fact that Nintendo felt that they needed to put out a special announcement video in early 2019 to announce that they had to restart the development of Metroid Prime 4, where they apologized and promised that they would do their best to make sure that Metroid Prime 4 would measure up to the quality of the original, that shows Nintendo's intentions with Metroid Prime 4. They don't normally do something like that to announce a restart in a dedicated video on their social media channels. The only time Nintendo's ever done anything like that is for the mainline 3D Legend of Zelda games. And so I think that speaks to the amount of care Nintendo is treating Metroid Prime 4 and the amount of investment they're willing to put in for Metroid Prime 4. They've been plugging away at this game for years. And it wasn't until summer of last year that they finally showed it off for the first time. And I think the only reason why they showed it off for the first time last year is because by that point they knew this game was close enough to be safe to show off. In other words, by summer of last year, Nintendo already had a pretty good idea that this game was not that far off and was shaping up to be a pretty strong release. But even considering recent happenings here, there's been some talk about when Metroid Prime 4 is coming out. At first we thought it might come out early on to the Switch 2 lifecycle, if not a launch title, within the first month or two. And at this point it's pretty clear that it's coming out a little bit later. But Nintendo has maintained the 2025 release window since summer of last year. And Metroid Prime 4 has been featured as a part of the Switch 2 launch marketing all over. It may not be getting as talked about or as shown off as Mario Kart World or Donkey Kong Bonanza, but it is a part of this launch marketing here. And so what I think that tells us is that, one, it is coming out early on for Switch 2, in other words, this year, but because they haven't been talking about it as much as Mario Kart World or Donkey Kong Bonanza, that simply means it's coming out a little bit after those games, which is obvious. But I only point that out because some people might think, oh, they're not advertising Prime 4 as much as Mario Kart or Donkey Kong, therefore Nintendo does not care. I think it's simply a matter of they're not marketing it as much because it's coming out a little bit later. Mario Kart World had the focus, now Donkey Kong Bonanza has the focus, and afterwards, at some point, Metroid Prime 4 will become the marketing focus. And I think there's even actually a pretty good opportunity here for Metroid Prime 4 to have its own dedicated Nintendo Direct. Now, I'm not saying that's when we're going to be getting our release date. I actually still think there's probably going to be some sort of general July Nintendo Direct presentation, and then there we'll likely get a release date, and maybe then they'll also announce a Prime 4 Direct a little bit later, or they'll just handle it like Donkey Kong Bonanza, where they'll give us the release date in the next Direct, but later on, closer to release, they'll just randomly announce a big Prime 4 Direct about a day or two before it actually happens. And I think this is likely because when we look at the year of 2017, Nintendo had a lot of game-specific directs for their launch year, and in this launch year Switch 2, we're starting to see a very similar pattern here. And so the next big game, like Mario Kart and Donkey Kong, would be Prime 4, so I think there's a really good chance this may actually be happening. And so I definitely think the marketing is going to ramp up soon. I don't think the lack of a lot of marketing right now is a sign that it's going to get delayed. As I already said, it wouldn't be as featured with all this launch promotion if Nintendo had some concerns that it wasn't planned for this year. We've even seen, actually, that Nintendo recently had to update this London advertisement of Prime 4 because there was a mistake where it was said to be out now. It's not out now, it's just coming out in 2025. But also, within that promotion, we now have a PEGI rating for Metroid Prime 4, which further supports the idea that the game is getting ever closer to release. The fact that it's now been rated in some regions is a very good sign. So the point here is that talking about Metroid Prime 4 getting cancelled or delayed is really just doom-mongering. There's no evidence to suggest that. In fact, all the evidence supports to the contrary. But then you have people who are concerned that Metroid Prime 4 is not going to be a good game or a great game. And at this point, I will at least concede that we do not know if Metroid Prime 4 is going to come out and be the greatest game ever made, or be in that conversation, or even be a Game of the Year candidate. It is possible it may fall short of that level of critical acclaim. But I do have to say, when we look at things historically speaking, chances are this game is going to be close to, if not in the conversation for Game of the Year. Let's take a look at the history of Retro Studios releases in terms of critical acclaim. As you see here, their average Metacritic score for their releases, they've released 9 games, is an 89. A game with an 89 Metacritic score would very likely be a Game of the Year nomination. In some years, that could have even won Game of the Year depending on the situation. And I think odds are Prime 4 probably is going to be a little bit higher. Because as you see here, it's the Donkey Kong games during the Wii and Wii U eras, and also their involvement with Mario Kart 7, they made a lot of the tracks, that drags down their score a little bit. Not to say that any of those games are bad, all of those games are fantastic. But taking a look strictly at the Metroid games here, they are all in the 90s, and in the case of Metroid Prime 1, the original release, one of the highest rated games ever, it came out in 2002 at a 97. Now, the remaster came out at a 94 back in early 2023. And so some people might argue that we haven't seen Retro Studios put out a good game in a long time, so we should be concerned. But Metroid Prime Remastered is a recent release from Retro Studios, and it still maintains incredible quality. But some people might say, well, you know, it wasn't just Retro Studios working on that game, others were involved, such as Iron Galaxy. And so Iron Galaxy is responsible for some of their own games like Extinction, Dive Kick. But when we take a look at Iron Galaxy's Metacritic scores, they have an average of 75. That's a lot lower than Retro's 89, and it should also be pointed out, they do a lot of support work, like how they helped with the remaster of Metroid Prime. So they are working on a lot of already good games, and those scores go up. But when we look at some of Iron Galaxy's own exclusives, such as Extinction, you start to see that their own work isn't necessarily that great, at least according to critical acclaim. So I'm not here trying to say that they're bad, like look at Killer Instinct, they've been involved with that and that's good, but my point here is that, look, Dive Kick, another game that they are responsible for that didn't have the highest review scores. My only point here is that the reason Metroid Prime Remastered was so good was likely because of Retro Studios, and not that much because of Iron Galaxy. Retro Studios is still known for their quality even so many years later. And it's been well documented that throughout the entire Switch era, Retro Studios has been continually hiring AAA talent. So they've been hiring some of the best talent throughout the industry over these years. And I actually found this comment from friend of the channel Reese Kiwi Talks Riley on Twitter to be very interesting. For those that don't know, Kiwi Talks has a YouTube channel where he interviews a whole bunch of different developers from the industry, so he is well connected. And so he said this: once Metroid Prime 4 releases, you're unlikely to see devs leaking away at the edges compared to previous years. Why? It's too risky for devs given the climate we are in. Nintendo doesn't really do layoffs, and that is a huge deal for devs these days, when you have a great deal of job security. In fact, since Michael Kelboff became CEO, I have never heard a bad thing about Retro's culture. In fact, given all the connections, I have to say it's the best place to work culture-wise next to Valve, of the big AAA studios. On top of that, engineers and designers get to work hand in hand with Nintendo EPD themselves, who are probably the best there is from a design and mechanics standpoint. So there are multiple big takeaways here from what Kiwi Talks is saying. 1. Retro Studios has been building up talent for years throughout the Switch era, and based off the opinion of Kiwi Talks, who is well connected with different developers in the industry, he does not think this talent is going to go away, and when you consider the overall environment right now, how there are so many layoffs everywhere, and how with Nintendo, job security is quite high by comparison, I do think it makes sense to believe that Retro Studios is going to maintain the quality they've built up. Now, that point may speak more towards the future of Retro Studios after Metroid Prime 4, but even post-launch, I'm sure Retro Studios will continue to support the game, so if there are any issues, they will find ways to rectify or improve it. Not that I think that will be much of a problem, because typically Nintendo games don't come out with too many issues like this. Another point being made by Kiwi Talks here, though, is that Retro Studios, being wholly owned by Nintendo, is actually totally a part of Nintendo and gets to work with Nintendo EPD, some of the best developers in the world, which will further strengthen and bolster what's going on at Retro Studios, who, historically speaking, has already been known to be an incredible developer. And so I think this is important to consider, because with Metroid Prime 4, there's been a huge investment here. I don't think Nintendo is going to allow Metroid Prime 4 to be a bad game. That's why they restarted the game. That's why they put out that statement. That's why they've been pouring in all this budget over all these years, because they want to make sure Metroid Prime 4 comes out to be a great game that measures up to the quality of its predecessors. And so the ultimate point here is that there's plenty of reason to believe that Nintendo's doing everything they can to make sure Metroid Prime 4 is of high quality, just like prior releases, which could very well put it in that Game of the Year conversation. But a lot of people may not feel that way from what they've seen of the game so far. You just look at what's been seen, and some people might not be really feeling the game too much. Well, what I find interesting about that is that many people have said very similar things about Donkey Kong Bonanza, and what happened. Nintendo showed more off of Donkey Kong Bonanza, and as it turns out, Donkey Kong Bonanza has a lot more to offer, and all of the previews of this game have been very favorable. Now, the game hasn't come out yet, so maybe the game comes out and we change our minds, but given that the Mario Odyssey team, or at least a part of the Mario Odyssey team, has been working on this, odds are this game is going to be a very, very good game. And so I think we're looking at a similar scenario with Metroid Prime 4, where they've shown off a little bit of the game, not a lot of the game. Something that I think is an interesting little comparison here. Before the Bonanza Direct, we'd only seen a significant gameplay for two areas, Ingot Isle and the Lagoon Lair. And from what we understand, these are basically the first two areas of the game. Now, considering Metroid Prime 4, what have we actually seen of this game so far? The first few minutes that we've seen played through in the treehouse, which is just the introductory area to the game, which from what I can gather is actually shorter and smaller than what we've even seen from Ingot Isle, the first area of Donkey Kong Bonanza. And then beyond that, what else have we seen? One trailer that shows off the beginning of Vuros, which I will argue is essentially an equivalent to what we've seen of the Lagoon Lair, the second area you explore in Bonanza. And so we might be looking at a similar scenario here in terms of how Nintendo is presenting these games. They're only showing off footage from the first couple beginning areas. And actually what's interesting here is that you can make an argument, and I think a pretty good one, that they've shown off even less of Metroid Prime 4 in comparison to Bonanza pre-Bonanza Direct, because guess what? At least with Bonanza, that initial trailer, it shows a whole bunch of snippets of a whole bunch of different areas of Bonanza. In contrast to Metroid Prime 4, we haven't seen snippets of anything else beyond the first two areas of the game. And so I actually think Nintendo's holding back even more on Metroid Prime 4 in comparison to Bonanza, and once they showed off their cards for Bonanza, so many people changed their tune about the game, and now people are talking about Bonanza being a Game of the Year contender. And I think something very similar is going to happen with Prime 4 once they actually start to fully promote this game. That all said though, I still recognize that it's reasonable to look at what we've seen so far and make judgments from what we have seen so far. And I'm going to argue that from many angles, from what we have seen so far, there's plenty of reason to expect high quality with Metroid Prime 4. From what we have seen in Metroid Prime 4 so far, at least from a performance technical perspective, is extremely impressive and stands above pretty much anything else we've seen on Switch 2, or Switch 1 for that matter. When we initially saw gameplay of Prime 4 last year, there's this huge conversation online going on about how Prime 4 might have been the first Switch 2 gameplay shown off, and that's not true, but the fact that that conversation happened and a lot of people were considering it goes to show how impressive Prime 4 is, which, if you take a look at Prime Remastered, that also speaks to that as well, Many people, myself included, have talked about how Prime Remastered is already arguably one of, if not the best looking game on Switch 1, and we even have developers go on record for saying that they thought what was accomplished here seemed almost impossible. But now considering the Switch 2 version of Metroid Prime 4, how they've improved the textures, added high dynamic range, 4K support, 120 frames per second support, these are things that we can't say for all other Switch 2 editions. Yes, the HDR, but the improved textures, the 120 frames per second, the 4K resolution, not many games can make those claims in terms of their enhancements on Switch 2. And then of course there's also the mouse controls, which many people have said really sold them on Metroid Prime 4. So quite clearly, there are already several things here that are highly evidential of Retro Studios putting forward great quality and technical expertise. But what about the gameplay itself? Have we seen things about the game that make us feel a little bit better about what this is going to be? And that's where there's a little bit more room for debate. Because some people want more than what is already established with the Metroid Prime formula, and others just want what was already established with the Metroid Prime formula. As we discussed, the Prime Metroid Prime games were already all fantastic, so why fix what isn't broken? Well, I'll say this. It's been many years since Metroid Prime 3 came out. That was back in 2007. These games came out in the early 2000s. Much has changed since then. The expectation and the evolutions that have happened across first-person games has been quite a lot, so our expectations and standards have changed. You look at Metroid Prime Remastered, and on Metacritic it's a 94. It's not a 97. And while both scores are amazing, a 97 was a historically great score for the time. Prime Remastered, with its enhancements to help modernize the game, was only at a 94 by comparison. And while I don't want to put too much stock into review scores, I do think it is a metric that can help us to understand how our expectations and standards have changed over the years. So basically, the Metroid Prime formula needs to catch up to modern standards, so there do need to be changes. And we have seen some evidence of those changes, albeit subtle, minimal ones. We've seen that you can do an aerial dash now, which was not an option in prior games. You can do a back dash and such and move around the air, more maneuverability there. And that's going to make a difference because when we look at prior Prime games, they were kind of slow and movement was limited, at least in comparison to modern first-person games now. So there have been at least some advancements there. Will there be more? That remains to be seen. But then when you also account for the mouse controls, which admittedly would only be available on the Switch 2 version, that really does speed up the flow of gameplay there in terms of aiming and moving around. Now, on the Switch 1 version, I would presume you'd still have access to all the motion controls that you could use like you could in Prime 1 Remastered. And so those are still options, but the mouse controls from what we have heard are on a whole other level here. Now from what we have seen of the game so far, albeit very little of it, it does appear to function and flow very similar to prior Prime games, but we have also seen some interesting additions like all the different psychic powers, and that's sure to add to the game as well and make it feel different from prior Prime games. But let's now end on this. How will Metroid Prime 4 perform? When I look at the success of Metroid Dread, I find it hard to believe that a game like Metroid Prime 4 that's clearly on a whole other level of ambition here and is going to be pushed on a whole other level, we presume, Prime 4 is likely to at least outsell Metroid Dread and become the best-selling Metroid game of all time. At least when we account for the combined sales of the Switch 1 and Switch 2 versions of Metroid Prime 4. I'm sure there are going to be some people who argue otherwise, that Metroid Prime 4 is not necessarily guaranteed to surpass Metroid Dread. Maybe there's going to be a lot more competition. Maybe Nintendo's not going to push Metroid Prime 4 as much as they pushed Metroid Dread. Maybe people simply won't like Metroid Prime 4 as much as they liked Metroid Dread, but I think that most likely it's going to go in the opposite direction. Typically, the bigger scope games that tend to sell better. There's a reason games like Mario Odyssey, Breath of the Wild, Kirby and the Forgotten Land have reached historical records because Nintendo went bigger, broader, more ambitious, and those games reached all-time highs for their respective series. Now, I'm not here trying to say Metroid Prime 4 is going to go open world. I'm simply stating that Metroid Prime 4 in comparison to Metroid Dread is a bigger, more ambitious experience, and I do believe the consumer will respond to that. But how much more will Metroid Prime 4 sell than Metroid Dread? And that's the part we still don't know. And we're not going to know for some time, but we might start to get a better idea once Nintendo truly opens the gates on this game and shows us what it truly has to offer, beyond the first 30 minutes or so of this experience. Ultimately though, I am not worried about Metroid Prime 4 nor do I think anyone else should be either. This is going to at least be a great game. Now, maybe if you have the expectation that this is going to be one of the greatest games ever made, maybe then there's some room for concern because that is a lofty goal. But can it be done? Considering the history of Metroid and what Retro Studios has been able to accomplish and all the backing Nintendo seems to have with this project, I would say, it's at least something to pay attention to. But what do you all think? Let me know in the comments below. This is AndresRestart. Thank you so much for listening and watching, and I'll see you all really soon. Take care. Bye.